Walter Hendricks had not held $100 bill in his own name for 11 days. He had given up his truck, his phone, and the soft leather jacket his late wife Margaret once bought him for a birthday he no longer wanted to remember. What remained was a man in his 70s, wearing a coat with a torn pocket and boots that had seen 40 years of Nebraska winters, standing on a porch that used to be his son's driveway before it became a gated entrance with cameras mounted on brick pillars. He knocked twice. He waited. He knew this house. He had paid for the down payment on it 12 years ago, back when his son Gerald had nothing but ambition and a business plan written on the back of a napkin. Now the napkin was a company, and the man who built it from nothing was standing at the door like a beggar, because that was exactly what he wanted his son to believe he had become. The door opened only a few inches. A housekeeper looked him over the way people look at something they are trying to decide is a threat or simply an inconvenience. Walter asked, in a voice roughened by cold, if Gerald was home. He said he only needed a few dollars, maybe a meal. He did not say his name. He wanted to see what would happen if the man behind that door had no way of knowing that the stranger asking for scraps was the same man who once carried him on his shoulders through cornfields taller than both of them. Gerald appeared behind her, phone still in his hand, mid-sentence with someone on a business call that mattered more to him in that moment than the man standing in the cold. He glanced at Walter for exactly 2 seconds. 2 seconds was enough for him to categorize the old man as one more stranger who wandered into the wrong neighborhood, one more problem that did not belong to him. He told the housekeeper to give the man $5 from the drawer by the door and to make sure he did not come back. Then he turned, already forgetting the exchange, and disappeared back into the warmth of a home his father's money had built. Walter did not correct him. He took the $5, folded it once, and walked back down the driveway his own hands had once paid for, without looking back, because he already knew what he needed to know. Somewhere inside that home, a son had just turned away his own father without ever asking his name. What Gerald did not know was that this was only the first door. There would be 3 more, each one testing a truth that money can never buy and grief can never fake. Whether the people who called him father would recognize him even when he had nothing left to offer them but himself. With Margaret gone and time running shorter than he wanted to admit, Walter needed an answer to a question that had kept him awake since the funeral. Which one of his children loved the man, and which one had only ever loved what the man could give them? By the time Walter reached the end of the block, he sat down on a bus stop bench that did not belong to anyone, and allowed himself to ask the question out loud for the first time. Had he raised 4 children, or had he simply financed 4 strangers who shared his last name? He only had 3 more doors left to knock on, and a growing fear that the answer he already suspected was the truest one of all. The cold had settled into his hands by then, and he flexed his fingers slowly, watching his breath cloud in the streetlight. 40 years ago, this same body had worked fields before sunrise without complaint, had carried Gerald on its shoulders through cornfields taller than either of them, had built something out of nothing through sheer stubbornness and love for a family he believed would always recognize him regardless of circumstance. He was no longer certain that belief still held. He rose from the bench slowly, joints protesting the cold, and began the long walk toward wherever the night would take him next, carrying nothing but a torn coat, a folded $5 bill, and a question he was no longer sure he wanted answered. 3 questions followed Walter home that night. Which of his 4 children would show up for a stranger with nothing to offer in return? Which of them had built their entire identity around distance from the life he gave them? And when the truth surfaced, whether he would have the strength to accept it, even if it meant admitting he had misjudged the people he loved most. He did not yet know the answers. He only knew that money, the very thing that built his empire, was about to become the exact tool he needed to strip every performance away from the 4 people who called him father. He thought back, lying awake that night, to a specific afternoon nearly 4 years earlier, before Margaret's diagnosis, when all 4 children had gathered at the farmhouse for what turned out to be one of the last truly easy family dinners any of them would share together. He remembered laughter around that table, an ease between siblings that had not survived the years since, and he wondered now whether that ease had been genuine or simply the last performance Margaret's presence had made possible before her absence stripped it away entirely. There was a 4th question too, one he did not allow himself to say aloud even in his own thoughts. If the test revealed that none of them had truly kept him in their hearts, what would he do with the rest of his life, and with everything he had built for people who might not have wanted the man behind the money at all? He had built an empire large enough to secure every one of his children's futures twice over, yet he could not say, with any real confidence, which of them loved him, and which had simply learned to tolerate him because of what he could provide. That uncertainty had followed him quietly for 3 years since Margaret's funeral, and now, walking cold streets in a coat that no longer felt like his own, he finally understood that he needed an answer he could trust completely, not one softened by politeness or shaped by the knowledge that he was being watched. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Walter built his life out of dirt that most people considered worthless, a stretch of Nebraska farmland his own father had barely kept afloat, turning it decade by decade into one of the most profitable agricultural operations in the state. He was the son of a man who had lost 2 crops to drought before Walter turned 10, and he grew up believing the only thing standing between a family and ruin was work nobody else was willing to do. He married Margaret at 23, a quiet woman with a sharper mind for business than he ever gave her credit for in public, and together they raised 4 children in a farmhouse that smelled of hay and coffee long before it smelled of money. In the earliest years of their marriage, Walter and Margaret shared everything, including the fear that the farm might not survive another bad season. Gerald was born during one of those hungry winters. Lisa came 2 years later, followed by Thomas 3 years after that, and finally Emily, born nearly a decade after her eldest brother, in a year when the farm had finally turned its first real profit. Margaret often said that each child arrived exactly when the family needed them most. Gerald left for business school at 18 and never truly came home again, chasing a version of success that made the farm feel small. Lisa married into a world of country clubs and charity boards, and her husband Richard Cole's family had never once discussed the price of feed at dinner. She adapted to that world, root by root, until the farmhouse itself began to feel foreign to her. Thomas stayed closest geographically, building his own contracting business only 40 minutes away, but carried a belief, quietly at first and then more openly, that Walter had funded Gerald's ambitions more generously than his own, a belief Walter never fully understood the depth of until much later. Only Emily remained tethered to the values Margaret tried hardest to protect, visiting the farmhouse every week without exception. Walter often noticed, even in those early years, how differently each child seemed to relate to the land itself. Gerald treated the farm as a stepping stone from the very beginning, asking questions about profit margins before he was old enough to spell the word correctly. Lisa loved the farm's beauty more than its function, arranging wildflowers on the kitchen table rather than helping in the fields. Thomas worked harder physically than either of his older siblings, though he complained more too, certain from a young age that his effort went unnoticed. Emily simply loved it, without complication, in a way that made both her parents quietly relieved that at least one of their children had inherited the land's simplicity, along with its promise. When Margaret passed 3 years before this story begins, after a slow illness that gave the family time to say goodbye but never enough time to feel prepared, something in Walter's understanding of his family began to unravel. The funeral drew all 4 children home for the first time in years, and Walter watched them interact through a haze of grief, noticing distances he had never measured while Margaret was alive to soften them. Gerald delivered a polished eulogy that felt disconnected from the woman he had actually married. Lisa cried genuinely but retreated quickly into funeral logistics. Thomas stood at the back, arms crossed, saying almost nothing. Emily stayed behind afterward to help Walter pack away Margaret's things, simply present in a way the others had not managed to be. In her final months, Margaret had spoken to Walter with a clear-eyed honesty she rarely allowed herself while healthy. She told him Gerald would need to learn that ambition without connection curdles into something cold. She told him Lisa's polish was armor rather than vanity. She told him Thomas carried a hurt older than anything he blamed it on, rooted in simply feeling unseen as a middle child. And she told him Emily would be fine because Emily had always understood instinctively what the others were still learning. Walter carried those words with him after she passed, and they became the foundation beneath the doubt that eventually led him to the disguise. Margaret had always served as the quiet translator between Walter and his children, softening his blunt observations, explaining his silences in ways that made them feel less like rejection and more like the ordinary quiet of a man who had never learned to speak his feelings aloud. When she became too sick to manage that role, the family did not simply lose a mother. They lost the connective tissue that had quietly held four very different personalities together, and none of them, including Walter, fully understood how much weight she had carried until she was gone. Margaret's final months were spent mostly at the farmhouse, in the same bedroom where all four children had been born, cared for by a rotation of hospice nurses and by Walter himself, who insisted on handling much of her care personally. During those months, she noticed things about each of her children with a clarity she had rarely allowed herself while healthy and preoccupied with the daily business of raising them, and she shared those observations with Walter in fragments over quiet evenings, as though depositing them with him for safekeeping before she could no longer say them at all. The health scare came on an ordinary Thursday morning, a tightness in Walter's chest while walking the eastern field alone. Doctors called it a warning rather than a crisis, a signal that his heart, like the empire he built, was not as unshakable as everyone assumed. Lying in that hospital bed, Walter found himself thinking not about the farm, but about which of his children would be sitting beside him if this had been the real thing. He imagined Gerald arriving late, phone in hand. Lisa arriving polished even in crisis. Thomas arriving resentful, unsure how to translate old anger into tenderness, and Emily arriving simply, saying nothing that needed to be said, because her presence alone would have been the entire point. He did not know, lying there, whether these imagined scenes reflected the truth of his children or merely his own fears about them, shaped unfairly by years of quiet disappointment he had never voiced to anyone, not even Margaret. That uncertainty bothered him more than the diagnosis itself. He had spent a lifetime making decisions based on evidence, on soil samples and market data and careful negotiation, yet here he was, guessing at the truth of his own family based on nothing more than assumption and old wounds. He decided, somewhere in the quiet hours before dawn, that assumption was no longer good enough. Arthur Whitmore visited during recovery to discuss overdue estate paperwork, and it was there Walter first spoke the idea aloud, that he wanted to know the truth about his children before he distributed a single dollar of what he had built, without an answer shaped by the knowledge that he was watching. Arthur raised the ethical weight of testing the people you love, but did not try to talk him out of it, only asking how far Walter was willing to take the disguise. Walter answered that he was willing to take it as far as the truth required. Arthur, who had drafted enough wills to understand how differently people behave when they believe money is on the line, understood exactly what Walter was trying to accomplish, even as he privately worried about the toll it might take on a man recovering from a genuine cardiac scare. He asked Walter more than once during that conversation whether there was a gentler way to seek the same clarity, and each time Walter shook his head, insisting that anything less than total disguise would simply produce more performance, more careful management of his children's own images, rather than the unguarded truth he needed. Over the following weeks, Walter arranged his own disappearance quietly, transferring operations to trusted managers, disconnecting the phone number his children knew, telling no one else, not even Emily, because he needed every reaction untouched by suspicion. Before he began, he visited Margaret's grave alone, admitting to her the way he had admitted every difficult decision of his life for nearly 50 years, that part of him was afraid of what he might learn. He received no answer beyond the wind, and took that silence, as he often had, as permission to proceed. He put on the torn coat and worn boots, and walked toward Gerald's front door. In the days leading up to that first walk, Walter also wrote a letter, sealed and left with Arthur, to be opened only if something happened to him during the disguise that prevented him from explaining his intentions personally. He wrote that he loved all four of his children completely regardless of what the coming weeks revealed, but that love alone had stopped feeling sufficient as a foundation for trust after watching them drift further from him and each other since Margaret's passing. He considered simply asking each of his children directly how they felt about him, and rejected the idea each time, understanding from decades of negotiation that people rarely tell the truth when they know an inheritance hangs visibly in the balance. Walter did not leave the city right away. He spent 3 more days near Gerald's world, sleeping in a downtown shelter, learning that Gerald's development company was hiring temporary laborers for a warehouse renovation Walter himself had helped finance years earlier. He applied under a false name and worked alongside men half his age, his body aching in ways that reminded him how much time had passed since manual labor was a daily necessity. The shelter itself taught Walter something he had not expected to learn. He shared a room with 6 other men that week, each carrying a story he would never have encountered from behind the walls of his own success. Men who had lost jobs, marriages, and homes through circumstances far outside their control, and who nonetheless shared what little they had with each other without hesitation. One man, older than Walter by a few years, offered him a spare blanket on the coldest night without being asked, simply noticing that Walter was shivering. Walter thought often, during that week, about how easily kindness moved among people who had nothing left to protect, and how much harder it seemed to move among people who had everything to lose. Gerald visited the site twice that week, moving through with brisk efficiency, never once acknowledging a single worker beyond a cursory nod. On the 3rd day, a support beam shifted during demolition, and Walter pulled a younger worker, Marcus, out of the way just before a section of ceiling gave way. Gerald arrived minutes later, alerted by a panicked call, and his first words were not about the worker's safety but about liability, whether anyone had called a lawyer, whether this could be handled quietly. He never once turned to Walter, the stranger who had actually prevented the injury, to offer thanks. Walter stood there a moment longer than he needed to that afternoon, some small part of him still hoping his son might notice the stranger who had just prevented a serious injury on his property, might ask his name, might offer even the smallest gesture of gratitude that had nothing to do with liability or reputation. Gerald did not. He checked his watch, said something to his assistant about being late for another meeting, and left the warehouse as quickly as he had arrived, already dialing a phone call before he had even reached his car. That evening, Marcus found Walter at the charity kitchen and brought him gloves and coffee as thanks, refusing to accept that the gesture was unnecessary. The 2 men talked for nearly an hour, Marcus speaking about his mother working 2 jobs and the sister he was helping through college, entirely unaware of who he was actually sitting with. Walter made a private note to ensure Marcus's sister quietly received a scholarship once this was over. Sitting in a diner afterward, Walter understood that Gerald's coldness at the door had not been an aberration. It was a pattern, consistent whether the person in front of him was a stranger or an employee nearly crushed under a falling ceiling on his own property. A total stranger had shown him more warmth in 30 seconds than his own son had shown him across an entire week. Walter thought, walking back toward the shelter that night, about the boy Gerald had once been, eager and curious, following him through the fields before ambition reshaped him into someone Walter barely recognized. He suspected some of the responsibility belonged to him. He had rewarded ambition in Gerald for years without ever asking whether that drive was crowding out something more important. He did not confront his son that night. There were still 3 more doors left, and he needed to see all of it before drawing any final conclusions. Lisa Hendricks Cole lived across town in a neighborhood built entirely around appearances, her husband Richard's name on the boards of 2 hospitals and a private school. She had assembled a life deliberately, brick by brick, gala by gala, until almost nothing remained visible of the farmhouse she grew up in. She was hosting a charity gala the evening her father chose to test her, the kind of event where every conversation was really a performance for someone else in the room. Walter arrived at the edge of the property in his torn coat and asked a valet if he could speak to Mrs. Cole for just a moment. Lisa stepped outside, already irritated, and did not recognize her own father at first. Grief and distance had erased the parts of him that used to be familiar. When something in his eyes made her hesitate, she pushed the feeling aside, more worried about who might be watching from the ballroom windows than about the man in front of her. She pressed folded cash into his hand quickly, almost violently, and asked him to leave before her guests noticed. The valet who had first approached her had described the stranger only vaguely, and Lisa had assumed, walking out to meet him, that this would be a brief and forgettable interaction, the kind she had handled dozens of times before at other events. What she had not expected was the particular way the stranger's eyes held hers for a beat too long, an intensity that unsettled her without her fully understanding why, and she found herself speaking faster than usual, eager to end the exchange before it could develop into anything requiring more of her attention than she was prepared to give. Walter took the money without correcting her, watching his daughter's eyes dart nervously toward the glowing windows, toward the version of her life she had built specifically to never again resemble the farmhouse she grew up in. He asked, almost as an afterthought, whether she ever thought about her family. Her answer came too quickly, too rehearsed, and her eyes never fully met his. He walked away from the gala thinking about the little girl who used to arrange wildflowers on their kitchen table, and wondered when exactly she had learned that comfort mattered more than connection. 2 doors down, 2 children tested, and neither had recognized the man who raised them. Her answer, when it came, was the kind of vague sentiment she likely offered at other functions when someone asked about her background out of polite curiosity. Something about cherishing her roots, delivered with the same practiced warmth she used to thank donors for their generosity. But her hand had already begun gesturing toward the driveway, a clear signal that this conversation, however she chose to frame it internally, was over. He lingered near the stone wall a while longer, watching servers move between tables carrying trays of food that would have fed an entire farmhand crew for a week during his leaner years. A young valet on a smoke break nodded politely and asked, without any particular reason to, whether Walter needed a ride somewhere warmer. Walter declined, thanking him, but the small, unprompted kindness from a stranger paid minimum wage struck him more forcefully than he expected. Another quiet data point stacking against everything his own daughter's brief, anxious exchange had just revealed. Thomas Hendricks lived a very different life than his siblings, running a struggling contracting business out of a modest rental, still recovering from a divorce and a lawsuit he believed was unfair. Of all 4 children, he carried the deepest resentment toward his father, convinced for years that Walter had favored Gerald with opportunities he never offered anyone else. When a disheveled stranger showed up asking for day labor in exchange for a meal, Thomas saw only another complication in a week that had already delivered 2 canceled contracts. He pointed toward a stack of lumber and told the old man to get to work if he wanted to eat. The resentment Thomas carried had roots he could trace back to specific moments he replayed often during long drives between job sites. He remembered Walter co-signing a loan for Gerald's first business venture without hesitation, while Thomas had been told, only a few years later, that he needed to prove himself first before the family would consider anything similar for his own contracting ambitions. He did not know, because no one had ever told him plainly, that Walter's caution had come from a different place entirely, a fear of enabling patterns Walter had noticed forming in Thomas's spending, rooted in protection rather than favoritism. Walter worked 6 hours in the cold without complaint, his body remembering labor from a lifetime ago. As the day wore on, Thomas grew talkative with a coworker nearby, unaware the stranger within earshot could hear every word. He complained about a father who had grown cold since his mother passed, about feeling invisible while his older brother collected praise for less effort. He spoke about the divorce, the lawsuit, and how none of his siblings had reached out during either crisis with anything more than an obligatory phone call. At one point during the afternoon, Thomas approached to check on progress and found Walter reinforcing a support beam using a technique Thomas himself had learned from an old mentor years earlier, a small detail that gave him a brief flicker of curiosity about who this stranger actually was. He asked, almost dismissively, where the old man had learned to work like that, and Walter answered simply that he had spent a lifetime working land that didn't forgive mistakes easily. Thomas nodded, unimpressed, already moving on to the next problem demanding his attention. Walter absorbed every word in silence, understanding for the first time that Thomas's anger was not really about money at all. It was about a father who had been physically present but emotionally distant for years, who had mistaken silence for strength. When the job ended, Thomas handed him a sandwich and $20 and made clear the arrangement ended when the sun went down. Walter lingered near the gate afterward, watching his son argue quietly on the phone about a delayed payment. Understanding that Thomas's resentment had grown out of real, sustained struggle Walter had underestimated for years. Before leaving, Walter noticed Thomas carefully counting out cash from a thin envelope to pay his 2 remaining crew members in full before allowing himself anything at all, a small detail that told Walter something quietly redeeming about his son, even amid the bitterness he had just overheard. Thomas might have spoken harshly about his family to a stranger who couldn't have known better, but he had not once shortchanged the men who depended on him, even while his own business teetered near collapse. Walter carried that contrast with him toward the motel where he would spend the night before Emily's door awaited him. The last door belonged to Emily Hendricks, who taught second grade and lived in a rented house with a leaking roof and a garden she tended herself. She had the least to give of all 4 children, and yet when a stranger appeared at her door in the evening cold, she did not hesitate the way her siblings had. She invited him inside before she even understood who he was, wrapped a blanket over his shoulders, and warmed the only soup she had left, without asking what he could offer in return. As the soup warmed, she sat across from him at a small table that wobbled slightly on uneven floorboards, and began speaking gently about her own life, filling the silence the way people do when they sense someone else might be too exhausted to speak first. She spoke about her students, about a particular boy in her class who reminded her of her brother Thomas at that age, stubborn and misunderstood, and about how teaching had taught her more patience than she ever thought herself capable of. As she spoke gently about her mother's passing, something in Walter's voice, a specific turn of phrase Margaret used to use, made her stop mid-sentence. She studied his face by the low kitchen light, and slowly the stranger she had welcomed became the father she had been missing since the funeral. She did not recoil. She reached across the table and held his hand, tears falling freely, asking why he had let her believe, even for an hour, that he had nothing left. It was only over the course of that evening, as recognition settled fully into place, that Emily began asking questions about how long he had been living this way, whether he had eaten properly, whether he had somewhere safe to sleep at night. Her concern arrived instinctively, before any anger or confusion about the deception itself had the chance to surface, a detail that told Walter everything he needed to know about the order in which his youngest daughter's priorities naturally arranged themselves. Walter's voice finally broke under the weight of everything he had witnessed that week. Here, in the smallest house, with the least money and the most love, he had found the one child who saw him before she saw his circumstances. Before he left that night, she packed the remaining soup for him and pressed a folded 20 into his hand, the same amount Lisa had given him at her gala, though it meant something entirely different coming from a daughter who genuinely could not spare it. She made him promise to call her if anything happened to him for the rest of whatever this experiment required. Walking away from her small rented house that night, Walter found himself comparing the specific texture of each daughter's generosity. Lisa's money had come quickly, almost as a means of ending an uncomfortable interaction. Emily's had come slowly, deliberately, accompanied by food she likely needed herself, offered from a place that asked nothing in return and expected no acknowledgement beyond simple gratitude. The dollar amounts were nearly identical. The meaning behind them could not have been more different, and Walter carried that contrast with him for the rest of the disguise. The crisis came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the last door closed. Walter collapsed in a diner parking lot, clutching his chest, and was admitted to St. Vincent Memorial as an unidentified elderly male in critical but stable condition. A nurse named Patricia recognized him from an old newspaper clipping pinned to a break room bulletin board, a photo from a county fair ribbon cutting years earlier, and called Arthur Whitmore. Arthur made 4 calls that afternoon, telling each child only that their father was in the hospital and his condition was serious. He did not mention the test or where Walter had been living during the past month. He wanted to see, one final time, who would move without being told the full story, and who would ask what was in it for them before even considering getting in the car. Gerald let the call go to voicemail twice, then spent 40 minutes deciding whether the crisis justified rearranging his week, arriving 2 days later still dressed for the boardroom. Lisa froze at a spa appointment, sat in her car for 20 minutes, and arrived that evening still in her spa robe, disheveled in a way none of her friends had ever seen. Thomas dropped his tools without a word to his crew and drove faster than the roads allowed, realizing somewhere on that drive that the resentment he had nursed for a decade had never actually killed the part of him that still loved his father. Emily was already at the hospital before Arthur finished dialing her number, having left her classroom the moment a neighbor mentioned an old man matching her father's description had been rushed in. Walter drifted in and out of consciousness, absorbing Gerald's clipped business calls from the hallway, Lisa's anxious questions to nurses about how things might look, Thomas's uncomfortable silence, and Emily's steady presence, unchanged from the stranger's kitchen to the hospital room. By the third day, stable enough to speak again, Walter understood the crisis had told him more than any of the 4 doors before it. Money had not moved anyone that week. Fear had, obligation had, and in exactly one case, love alone had moved someone before either fear or obligation had the chance to. Gerald was in a meeting when the call first came through, deep in negotiations over financing for a new development project, and he let it go to voicemail twice before finally listening to it between appointments, assuming it was some routine matter related to the estate paperwork Arthur had been managing for years. When he finally understood the seriousness of the message, something flickered briefly across his expression that his assistant, watching from across the conference table, would later describe as genuine alarm, quickly suppressed and replaced by his usual composed efficiency. He lay in that hospital bed, surrounded now by all 4 of his children, in various states of exhaustion and unspoken tension, and understood that the time for disguise had finally ended, that whatever came next would require him to speak plainly, regardless of how difficult that revelation might prove for the family he still loved, despite everything the past month had shown him. He asked Arthur, quietly, once the room had emptied enough for a private word, to begin arranging the gathering at the farmhouse as soon as doctors cleared him to travel, understanding that delaying the reveal any longer would only allow the discomfort of the unanswered question to calcify further among his children. On the second night, when the room emptied except for Emily and a nurse checking vitals hourly, Walter surfaced from shallow sleep to find his youngest daughter still sitting exactly where she had been hours earlier, her head resting against the side of the bed, having refused the nurse's suggestion that she go home and rest. He did not wake her fully. He simply watched her sleeping form, feeling something settle in his chest that had nothing to do with his heart condition and everything to do with a certainty he had spent 3 years searching for without realizing how close it had been the entire time. Patricia, the nurse who had first recognized him, checked in periodically throughout those days as well, and on one occasion mentioned to Emily how unusual it was to see a family member stay as consistently and calmly present as she had, without the anxious hovering or impatient irritation Patricia often witnessed from other families during long hospital stays. Emily had simply shrugged and said there wasn't anywhere else she would rather be. Walter waited until he was strong enough to sit upright on his own, before asking Arthur to gather all 4 children at the old farmhouse, choosing it deliberately over the hospital, because he wanted the truth delivered somewhere none of them could hide behind polish or catered gatherings. One by one, Gerald, Lisa, Thomas, and Emily arrived at a house none of them had visited together in years, each uncertain why their father had summoned them instead of simply recovering in peace. Gerald spoke first, insisting there had to be some misunderstanding, that the man at his door had been nothing more than a stranger seeking a handout. Walter did not raise his voice. He simply described the exact words the housekeeper had used, the exact amount of money handed over, the exact 2 seconds Gerald had spent glancing at him before returning to his phone call, and the warehouse encounter, where Gerald's first concern had been liability rather than the safety of the man he never thanked. Gerald's protest died somewhere in his throat, replaced by the sinking understanding that his father had documented every second of his own failure. Lisa's reaction came quieter, but no less devastating to watch. She stared down at her hands on the table, remembering aloud how she had glanced over her shoulder toward her party guests, instead of truly looking at the man standing in front of her. She asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, whether he had planned this specifically to humiliate her. Walter told her honestly that humiliation had never been the goal. He only wanted to know who she had become since her mother's death, and now he knew. Thomas said nothing for a long stretch, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the grain of the table. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked in a way none of his siblings had heard from him before, admitting he had complained about their father to a coworker that day, not knowing the very man he resented was standing close enough to hear every word. Emily was the only one who did not look surprised. She had suspected since the night in her kitchen, though she had told no one, waiting instead to see how the rest of the test would unfold. Arthur reminded them gently that Walter had not shared any of this to punish anyone, but because he genuinely had not known what he would find. Gerald asked what came next, whether this meant a different inheritance conversation entirely. Walter told him consequences would follow, but that his intention had never been punishment. It had been clarity, the kind Margaret's presence had once provided naturally, and which had disappeared with her. The conversation stretched nearly 2 more hours, moving between confrontation and unexpected tenderness, old grievances finding their first real acknowledgement in years. The room stayed silent for a long while after the hardest exchanges had passed. 4 adults confronting versions of themselves they had never expected to see, reflected back so clearly. Walter looked at each of his children in turn, no longer as a farmer testing loyalty from a careful, calculated distance, but as a father forced to accept an answer he had feared since the day Margaret died, an answer that could not now be softened or reinterpreted, regardless of how uncomfortable its implications proved for everyone gathered around that old wooden table. Lisa asked, near the end, whether Emily had known beforehand, a question carrying an undertone of hurt she did not try to disguise. Walter explained Emily had only learned the truth the night she recognized him in her own kitchen, and had kept it to herself, out of respect for the process, rather than any desire to align herself favorably against her siblings. Thomas asked quietly whether Walter regretted the test at all, given what it had cost him physically. Walter admitted some part of him wished he had simply found the courage to ask his children directly, years earlier, but doubted direct questions at a dinner table would ever have produced the unguarded truths this test had ultimately surfaced. Arthur returned 3 weeks later with the paperwork. Gerald received his portion of the estate tied to a condition Walter insisted on personally: quarterly meetings. No exceptions. Lisa's inheritance stayed largely intact, but Walter added a personal letter asking her simply to come home more often, not for money, but because he missed her. Thomas began working alongside his father, rebuilding portions of the farm's aging structures, slow and occasionally tense, but steady. Emily received the smallest financial share of the 4, and the only settlement with no conditions attached at all, because trust, once proven without hesitation, needed no clause to enforce it. Arthur noted privately, reviewing the final paperwork before filing it, that of all 4 settlements, Emily's stood apart precisely because it required nothing of her going forward. Walter had built protective conditions into 3 of the 4 arrangements, mechanisms designed to encourage the kind of presence and honesty his other children had not offered freely on their own. Only Emily's inheritance existed without any such mechanism, because she had already demonstrated, repeatedly and without prompting, exactly the kind of relationship Walter had spent a month searching for. Not every wound closed neatly. Gerald and Thomas remained distant from each other for months. Lisa struggled quietly with the version of herself she had glimpsed at that table. But by spring, small changes had taken root. Gerald learning his crew's names, Lisa calling on ordinary Tuesday evenings for no reason beyond wanting to talk, Thomas finally asking about the old loan refusal, and hearing, at last, the reasoning behind it. The quarterly meetings Walter had insisted upon with Gerald began awkwardly, both men uncertain how to fill an hour of conversation that wasn't structured around business. But by the 3rd meeting, Gerald had begun arriving without his phone visible on the table between them. Lisa's transformation moved more slowly, though Walter noticed it in accumulating gestures. She visited the farmhouse twice that spring without any occasion requiring it, once bringing her own daughter, Walter's granddaughter, whom he had seen far too rarely in recent years. Thomas and Walter's rebuilding project stretched through the summer, slower than either expected, but steady in a way that mattered more than speed. Walter sat on his porch many months later, the same porch where Emily once wrapped a blanket around a stranger's shoulders, and understood that money had never been the real subject of the experiment. It had only ever been the disguise he used to strip away performance and see who his children were underneath it. 3 of them had shown him fear, convenience, and old grievance the moment they believed no one was watching. Only 1 had shown him love exactly as it should exist, without conditions, without hesitation. He often wondered, in the quiet hours after everyone had gone home from Sunday dinners that had slowly begun resembling the family gatherings Margaret used to host, whether the test had been fair to ask of people at all, whether some truths are only found by forcing the people we love into circumstances they never agreed to be tested by. He never fully resolved that question, only that love proven under no observation at all is the only version of love a person can ever truly trust completely. If you were in Walter's position, would you have had the courage to ask the same question? Let us know in the comments what you would have done. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next one.